Welcome. Today we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating piece of Athenian history. We're talking about a powerful institution that stood for ancient justice, wisdom, and, well, maybe above all, integrity. The Areopagus, the court on the Hill of Ares. Long before you had the big democratic assemblies, the kind of chaotic ones, justice in Athens happened here. At its oldest, its most sacred court, meeting on this legendary rocky outcrop right near the Acropolis.
Oh, absolutely. It's a place just steeped in myth, isn't it? I mean, for the ancient Athenians, this was ground zero for their legal system. The legend, as you probably know, is that the god Ares himself was tried right there on that hill for murder, no less. Poseidon's son. And that trial, that sort of divine precedent, it set the stage for all the serious homicide trials that followed. So right from the start, the Areopagus gets this reputation, this aura of solemn, ritualistic procedure. Very aristocratic, very traditional, a world away from the later people's courts.
Yeah, and that's the real tension here, isn't it? The paradox we kind of need to unpack.
Right.
Because you have these incredibly ancient procedures, the accuser and accused on separate stones, taking these terrifying oaths by the Furies, trials held outside at night. But our mission today really is to look beyond just the myth. Our sources, they actually pull us forward into the classical democratic period, and they show the Areopagus evolving into something, something quite unexpected, a judicial body that seems uniquely tasked with rooting out corruption among Athens' top politicians.
Exactly. Historically, its reputation was built on wisdom and partiality. It was mostly made up of former archons, the top magistrates. But then you have the democratic reforms, Ephialtes in 462 BCE, which stripped away a lot of its direct political oversight, leaving it mainly as this revered homicide court, but, maybe more ceremonial in some ways. But what we're really digging into today is how its power seems to resurge, specifically around these high-stakes issues of integrity, making it maybe, ironically, the kind of aristocratic check on a democracy that was, frankly, wrestling with its own political problems, including corruption.
Right. So that's our starting point. Let's unpack how this incredibly revered ancient court becomes the go-to investigator, or perhaps the most politically useful investigator when it came to financial and political rot. Okay, so let's jump to the later classical period. The Areopagus had its political power trimmed way back centuries earlier, right? But suddenly it pops up again in our sources doing something very specific, very concrete, and pretty sensational, acting as an anti-corruption watchdog. And the big case, the one everyone talks about, is the Acropolis affair. Why is this scandal the key piece of evidence for this later function of the Areopagus?
Well, I think it really boils down to trust, or maybe the lack of trust elsewhere. You see, the main democratic courts, the dicasteria, they were huge. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of jurors. Which sounds democratic, but it also made them prone to political manipulation, mob rule sometimes, maybe even instruments of personal vengeance rather than impartial justice. We'll definitely touch on that later. So when Athens is facing this massive scandal, Alexander the Great's treasurer, Harpalus, runs off, shows up in Athens, showering politicians with money he basically stole. Well, the city needed a body whose verdict would just land with instant, unimpeachable moral authority. And the Areopagus, with its ancient reputation, its almost religious aura, it was perfect. They leveraged that ancient prestige for this very purpose.
So they kind of dusted off this old, venerable, aristocratic institution to deal with a very modern-seeming problem, political bribery on a grand scale. And we're not talking small amounts here, are we? This involves huge sums. It really points to a potential breakdown at the highest levels.
Oh, colossal sums. The sources suggest Harpalus arrived with a treasure chest that could seriously destabilize the state. Specifically, the focus was on 700 talents. That's an enormous amount of silver, delivered supposedly for safekeeping on the Acropolis itself. The Areopagus was tasked with figuring out what happened to it, where did it go, and their finding was, well, devastating. They looked into it, and they satisfied themselves, as the sources put it, that the records for this massive deposit just stopped. The entries ceased at a certain point, which clearly indicated the money had disappeared.
Wow. A financial record just ending it's like the ancient equivalent of, I don't know, security footage cutting out right when the cash is being moved. So the Areopagus confirms it's gone. And they didn't just say the money vanished, did they? They pointed fingers. They found that a number of leading statesmen had pocketed considerable sums from Harpalus. This wasn't just missing money. It was high-level bribery, confirmed by the city's highest moral authority.
Exactly. And that leads us straight into the scandal surrounding Demosthenes, which is just fascinating because of the sheer political irony. I mean, here's Demosthenes, the ultimate champion of Athenian freedom, the orator who spent his career railing against Philip of Macedon, and then Alexander. And yet the Areopagus report explicitly names him as having received 20 talents of this stolen money.
20 talents. That's still an incredible amount of money. Like, what, maybe 1,000 times what an average worker might earn in a year, roughly? How could the proof against such a monumental figure, such an icon, be so strong that the Areopagus felt confident enough to name him?
Well, the sources suggest it was pretty damning because essentially Demosthenes confessed, although maybe confessed isn't quite the right word. He admitted taking it, but tried to justify it. His attempted excuse was, let's just say it didn't go over well. Contemporaries called it a paltry and transparent subterfuge.
Okay, let's break down that excuse. What was his story? He claimed he took the 20 talents to pay himself back for money he'd previously fronted for the Theoric Fund. That's the state fund for, like, public festivals and stuff.
That was the claim. But it fell apart almost immediately under scrutiny. Two massive problems with that defense. First, the money he took wasn't just any money. It was Harpalus's money, which was effectively Alexander's money, which Athens was just about to seize. So, by definition, it was stolen money he was handling, and he took it without any official say-so. Second, and this is the real kicker, the absolute core of the betrayal. Demosthenes himself was one of the commissioners responsible for overseeing that very deposit on the Acropolis. Its safety was literally his job.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So he wasn't just taking suspect money. He was the guardian who raided the vault he was supposed to be guarding. The sheer hypocrisy of it. The man preaching integrity, preaching resistance to Macedon, caught taking bribes from Alexander's rogue treasurer. That must have just shattered public trust. It's the ultimate insider trading scandal, ancient style.
Catastrophic is probably the right word. His guilt was seen as pretty much irrefutable. Even if you try to be charitable, some sources hint maybe he took it not for personal luxury, but maybe, for the good of his party, hoping to use it politically against Alexander. But legally, morally, it doesn't really matter why he took it. The offense was the same. He abused public trust and misappropriated stolen funds entrusted to his care.
And the fallout was swift.
Yep. A massive fine, 50 talents, more than double what he took, then imprisonment. And eventually, he actually managed to escape and flee Athens.
The implication for Athens must have been profound. I mean, think about it. If the guy leading the charge against the biggest external threat is himself corrupt, financially compromised, what does that say to the average citizen about their leadership, about the whole system?
It absolutely confirmed the worst fears, the most cynical views about Athenian politics. That ambition often trumped principle, that it was all about the money, ultimately. And the very institution brought in to uphold integrity, the Areopagus, ended up exposing just how fragile that idealism was. It showed that even the strongest ideological stance resisting Alexander wasn't necessarily proof against the lure of cold, hard cash. And of course, it gave massive ammunition to anyone who wanted to argue that democracy itself just bred corruption.
Okay, so the Harpalyst affair paints a pretty bleak picture. It really forces you to ask, was corruption just? Like the normal state of affairs in Athenian politics. But our sources do offer a contrast, don't they? They hold up certain figures as examples of near-perfect integrity, which suggests that honesty, probity, wasn't just nice to have. It was maybe the most valuable political currency of all.
That's a crucial point. We absolutely have to contrast Demosthenes with figures like Nicias and especially Phocion. These guys are explicitly praised in the sources, described as men whom millions would not have tempted. They represent the ideal, right? Maybe not the most brilliant leaders, but the ones you could trust with the public purse.
Phocion's case is particularly striking. Here's a guy whose reputation for integrity seems to have completely overshadowed his actual abilities, at least militarily. The sources basically say he was, a respectable sergeant at best, not exactly Alexander the Great. And yet, the Athenians elected him Strategos general 45 times. 45 times. Right. Why keep electing a mediocre general for almost half a century?
Because, as the sources say, he was known as a man superior to all temptations of money. It's almost unbelievable, isn't it? In a system where politicians were constantly accusing each other of embezzlement, bribery, you name it, the Athenians repeatedly turned to Phocion. It suggests they were so worried about financial mismanagement that they prioritized having an honest accountant in charge of the military budget over having a military genius leading the army. His entire political career was built on this rock-solid reputation for honesty. It speaks volumes, maybe quite cynically, about what the Athenians valued most, or perhaps feared most, in their leaders. They didn't trust talent, so they settled for honesty.
Wow. sacrificing potential military success just to make sure the funds weren't skimmed. That really underscores how corrosive the fear of corruption must have been.
But, the very fact that figures like Phocion are praised so highly for not being corrupt also highlights how common the opposite probably was, or at least how common the accusation of corruption was. These political battles weren't polite disagreements. They were often incredibly vicious, deeply personal feuds. And legal accusations, especially charges of corruption, were standard weapons in the political arsenal. Look at Hyperides. He'd been an ally of Demosthenes, but he's the one who steps up as the public prosecutor in the Acropolis affair. Political rivalries easily spilled over into the courts.
And the bitterness could get intensely personal, couldn't it? The feud between Demosthenes and Medius, even before Harpalus, is a prime example. Medius didn't just argue with Demosthenes, he physically assaulted him, struck him in the face while Demosthenes was performing a public religious duty as a Areopagus.
Yes, and the context there is absolutely vital. Areopagus wasn't just some guy. He was funding a chorus for his tribe during the Great Dionysia, a major religious festival. It was a prestigious civic duty. So for Medius, a wealthy aristocrat, to strike Demosthenes while he was wearing the sacred robes performing this service, it was a calculated outrage. It showed contempt not just for Demosthenes, but for the festival, for the gods, for the polis itself.
It was a public display of hubris, wasn't it? That kind of violent, overbearing arrogance the elites sometimes use to assert dominance, designed to humiliate Demosthenes, make him look weak, unable to respond, and therefore undermine his political standing.
Precisely. It was performance art in a brutal way, and understanding this context, this atmosphere of intense rivalry and public shaming, helps us see the massive gap between the solemn ancient tradition of the Areopagus and the messy, chaotic reality of Athenian popular justice. The Areopagus had its rituals, its gravity, but the people's courts, the dicasteria, they were different beasts altogether, much more volatile, much more emotional.
And when you look at the language used in those popular courts, especially after periods of upheaval, like the reign of the 30 tyrants, the call for justice sounds an awful lot like a call for revenge.
Absolutely. After the 30 were overthrown, there was a reckoning. The legal system was used to hold them accountable, but look at the procedures used during the tyranny itself. They sidelined the regular jury courts. They used things like apogoge summary arrest. You'd be hauled before the Council of 500. And that led directly to arrests, executions without the usual democratic process. Like Polemarchus, the brother of the orator Lysias, he was killed under the 30.
So when Lysias gets his chance to speak in court after democracy is restored, prosecuting one of the 30 Eratosthenes, his rhetoric is just dripping with raw emotion. He's practically telling the jurors, get angry, feel the outrage. He uses the word orgistai.
Yes, orgistai. To show anger, righteous indignation. This wasn't just a lawyer trying to sway a jury, it was more fundamental. The orators demanded this public display of anger because the jurors weren't seen as detached, objective judges. They were often victims themselves or represented victims. They'd lost relatives, property under the 30. So their judgment was expected to be fueled by that anger, that sense of personal and collective injury. They were enacting vengeance both for themselves and vicariously for those who couldn't punish their enemies anymore.
And Lysias pushes it even further rhetorically, right? He suggests almost applying talio, an eye for an eye, against Eratosthenes and the other surviving members of the 30. He even hints at going after their sons, executing them too.
Yeah, he knew that was legally impossible under Athenian law at the time. You couldn't punish sons for the father's crimes like that. But the rhetoric served a purpose. It validated the jurors' desire for the harshest possible punishment. It framed justice as demonstrating maximum anger and enmity towards these guys. The courtroom became this engine for channeling political hatred and vengeance, which is, again, a universe away from the cool, deliberative, aristocratic ideal represented, at least in theory, by the court on the Hill of Ares.
So it's clear that maintaining judicial integrity was a constant battle in Athens, whether you're talking about the elite Areopagus or the massive popular courts. But this isn't just an Athenian problem, is it? If we zoom out, look at other ancient powers, especially Rome, we see them grappling with the exact same dilemmas in structuring their justice systems. How do you balance efficiency against corruption?
It's a fascinating parallel. And what's really striking is how the sheer size of the court, the number of judges or jurors, seems directly linked to how vulnerable it is to corruption. It's a lesson learned the hard way in both Athens and Rome. In the early Roman Republic, really important criminal cases, especially on appeal, were heard before these huge assemblies, the Idicia Populi, the courts of the people. You could potentially have Hundreds, maybe even thousands of citizens acting as jurors.
Right. Similar in scale, conceptually at least, to the Athenian dicasteria. And the logic seems sound. How do you bribe 1,000 people? It's just too expensive, too difficult logistically.
Exactly. The scale itself was a kind of defense mechanism against bribery. But as Rome's power grew, as it became the sprawling empire, that system just became too slow, too cumbersome, too unwieldy. So starting around the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome began shifting its approach pretty significantly. They moved towards establishing smaller, permanent jury courts, the questiones perpetuae.
These were specialized courts, right? Like one court for extortion cases, another for bribery, treason, murder, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Aimed at making justice more professional, more streamlined.
That was the idea. Streamline it, make it more efficient. But, and this is the crucial point, it came at a significant cost to integrity. The sources are pretty clear on this. Reducing the size of the juries, going from potentially thousands down to maybe dozens or a few hundred in these specialized questions, it made them, and I quote, more accessible to corruption.
So in trying to fix one problem, unwieldiness, maybe mob rule, they created another, arguably just as dangerous one. By making the jury smaller and more manageable, they inadvertently made them easier targets for the wealthy and powerful, who could now afford to influence or bribe a smaller pool of jurors. It's that constant tension, isn't it? Solving one judicial weakness potentially opens up a new vulnerability.
It really poses an existential question for the Roman system at that time. If the mass courts are too chaotic for an empire, and the smaller specialized courts are too easily corrupted, where do you go for reliable justice, especially in high-stakes cases involving powerful people?
And the answer, increasingly, becomes the emperor.
Yeah.
Imperial justice. It shows how power tends to concentrate when faith in other systems erodes.
Definitely. Augustus set the precedent, and later emperors, particularly Claudius, were known for personally sitting and dispensing justice. They'd hear both civil cases and serious criminal accusations in a process called cognitio. This was essentially an alternative path, bypassing the regular courts entirely.
And there are examples of people actively seeking this out, right? Because they didn't trust the regular courts.
Yes, there's a telling story involving a murder charge against a quaestor, a financial official. The accuser apparently feared they couldn't get a fair trial in the ordinary quaestio court. Why? Because the accused was being defended by Germanicus, a very popular and influential figure. The accuser worried about political influence swaying the jury, so what do? They successfully petitioned for the case to be heard directly by Emperor Augustus himself.
That's incredible. It perfectly illustrates why people turned to the emperor's cognitio. It seemed to offer a way to cut through the political maneuvering, the potential bribery, the complexities that could bog down or corrupt the specialized jury system.
The emperor's decision, in theory, was swift, decisive, and hopefully untainted by factional interests.
So, effectively, the burden of ensuring justice shifts dramatically. Instead of trying to guarantee the integrity of hundreds or thousands of diverse jurors, a decentralized approach. The system increasingly relies on the personal integrity and judgment of one single individual, the emperor.
The ultimate concentration of judicial power. It's a pragmatic solution, perhaps, but also a risky one.
Yeah.
You're betting everything on that one person's wisdom and self-control.
You know, whether we're talking about Demosthenes failing the integrity test or Lysias demanding vengeance in the courts, it feels like these legal systems, these struggles, are deeply rooted in some fundamental ideas about morality and justice in the ancient world. We keep bumping up against this core principle in the Greek world, that competitive, almost tribal moral code, which seems to fuel so much of the political conflict and the desire for retribution.
Absolutely. The dominant working principle, widely acknowledged, though maybe harsh to our ears, was essentially do good to your friends and do bad to your enemies. Justice wasn't necessarily seen as this abstract, universal ideal we might think of today. It was often very practical, very reciprocal, and deeply tied to your social relationships, your loyalties. If someone wronged you or your group, seeking vengeance wasn't just an option, it was almost a moral obligation, a duty.
Which inevitably feeds that cycle of violence, doesn't it? That idea captured in the Greek proverb, he who acts is acted upon, or sometimes the doer suffers.
Yeah.
It suggests that payback, reciprocal harm, is just the natural order of things, unless something contains it, unless there's a higher legal principle or maybe a philosophical shift.
And that's exactly where philosophy tries to step in, particularly with Socrates. When you look at the Socratic tradition, there's a real attempt to shift the focus. Justice moves from being about external actions, what you do to your enemy, to being about internal state, about self-mastery, what you do to yourself, to your own soul. Socrates fundamentally linked justice, and really all moral virtue, to wisdom Sophia. And that wisdom wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply entwined with sophrosuno, which means moderation, self-control, sound-mindedness.
Right. So being just isn't simply about knowing the law or resisting a bribe in one instance. It requires something deeper, that internal self-control, to consistently choose the right action, even when it's difficult or personally disadvantageous. That's where the moderation, the sophrosune, comes in, keeping your desires, your passions, your greed in check.
That is the absolute core of the Socratic insight, I think. Socrates argued that true practical knowledge, real wisdom, isn't just knowing facts. It has to penetrate, grip, and shape the passions. So if a statesman like Demosthenes or even a judge fails to do what they know they ought to do if they choose the corrupt path over the just one who, Socrates wouldn't just call it a moment of weakness. He'd argue it's a sign of defective knowing. Their knowledge isn't complete or isn't properly integrated.
A failure of justice is a failure of knowledge. How does that work practically? If Demosthenes knew taking the bribe was wrong, how is it defective knowledge?
Because, Socrates would argue, his true understanding of what is genuinely good for him, what is truly advantageous for his soul in the long run, was clouded. It was occluded or distorted by strong passion. The desire for wealth or maybe political power or perhaps even misguided patriotism, if we're being generous, that passion temporarily overwhelmed his wisdom. It made him believe, in that moment, that the unjust action taking the money was somehow more beneficial than the just action upholding his duty. His passion distorted his perception of true advantage.
That puts a completely different frame on someone like Demosthenes and the Harpalus affair, doesn't it?
Yeah.
His corruption wasn't just a political misstep or a moral failing in the ordinary sense. From a Socratic viewpoint, it was a deep, almost catastrophic failure of self-mastery, a fundamental defect in his soul's alignment with wisdom.
Absolutely. His passions, whatever they were, greed, ambition, fear, essentially overrode his practical knowledge of the good. He failed to choose correctly. The Areopagus provided the legal judgment, yes, but the Socratic framework offers a kind of moral diagnosis. The root failure wasn't just breaking a rule, it was a lack of self-mastery, a failure of wisdom to govern the soul.
And this framework also gives us a lens to look at the people's courts and that rhetoric of Lysias demanding anger, or Gizestai. If justice is defined by channeling raw anger and retribution, then passion is fundamentally driving the legal decision-making process, not wisdom and in the moment. That system, by its very nature, might be seen as operating on defective knowledge, even if the verdict feels satisfying or right in the moment.
Exactly. If the judges themselves are primarily acting out of anger, seeking vengeance, their own knowledge of true justice, which Socrates would define as the health and harmony of the soul, is clouded by that passion. They risk becoming part of the very cycle of reciprocal harm, the vendetta cycle, that a true system of justice should ideally contain and transcend. Hashtag, outro.
So we started this deep dive on the ancient, revered Hill of Ares, and we found that this aristocratic court, even after being stripped of many of its original powers, found this unexpected critical role in policing the integrity of Athens' political elite. The Harpalus affair stands out, showing dramatically how even the city's most famous orator, Demosthenes, the great champion of Athenian independence, could fall prey to corruption. Taking money he was sworn to protect and ultimately being condemned by the Areopagus, the body seen as perhaps the last bastion of incorruptibility.
Yeah, and our journey through the sources really highlights that this struggle with corruption, with maintaining integrity in public life, it's just perennial. It transcends specific systems. We saw how the immense value placed on the honesty of figures like Phocion paradoxically underlined just how deep the cynicism about politicians probably ran. And then we saw echoes of the same dilemma in Rome. Their attempts at judicial reform, moving from huge popular courts to smaller, specialized questions, seem like a logical step towards efficiency, but the sources tell us it just made the system more accessible to corruption.
Right. The Areopagus itself, revered for its ancient rituals and moral weight, ended up being both a check on democratic excess and the very stage where the conflict between public duty and private greed played out so starkly. Its investigation exposed the rot, but also perhaps the limits of its own ability to truly fix it.
And that leaves us and you, the listener, with some pretty deep questions, I think. We see throughout history these attempts to reform justice, often by shifting where power lies. Sometimes it's decentralized to the masses, like the Athenian popular courts. Sometimes it's concentrated in an elite few, like the Areopagus or the Roman specialized courts, or even in a single figure, like the emperor. But if Socrates was right, if true justice ultimately depends not just on rules and structures, but on inner wisdom and self-mastery, what kind of institution, ancient or modern, can ever truly guarantee the integrity of a statesman's heart? And maybe even more troubling, if legal systems, especially in response to great wrongs, find themselves needing to channel popular anger, that orgesis tie, to deliver what feels like justice. How does any system prevent that powerful tide of retribution from simply overwhelming everything, consuming the judges, the state, and the very idea of impartial justice itself?